I have to be egalitarian in selecting my characters that we do for this, because this is a major 30,000-foot flyover of 1st and 2nd Samuel. You know, you're just not going to get everything. So I wanted fair treatment, so we're going to talk about Abigail tonight in 1 Samuel 25. Abigail. And this is a longer chapter, so we have a few lessons to learn from this chapter, as we do every week, and we'll read down through it, because we'll see that Abigail was married to a godless man, and some of you have experienced that. And if you haven't experienced it, you know people who've experienced it. It's not easy. And it's a difficult thing, and it's in the next couple weeks in 1 Corinthians on Sunday night, we'll be dealing with that as well. The Bible is completely interconnected. There's nothing you'll find in the Old Testament that's not in the New Testament, and vice versa. In the New Testament, it's easily stated because it's written as an epistle, so we read it and it seems easy. But in the Old Testament, you'll find the narrative, you'll find the story that describes that. And so you'll see a little bit of what Abigail has to face with her husband, Nabal, N-A-B-A-L. Now, if you want to name any of your children Bible names, please do not pick this name. No. Because Nabal means fool in Hebrew. So, it's like, I pity the fool. So not good. All right, so we're going to start with verse 1, 25. Now Samuel died. There you go. You know, this is like a New York Times headline, you know. So-and-so wins the election, towers attacked, 2 words, Samuel dies. And all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house in Ramah. And then that's it. There's no more information. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Now remember what we talked about, right? You're in captivity, and then you're rescued. Rescued. And then you go into the wilderness, and then you go into the promised land. Do you remember this? Yeah. So David is where? In the wilderness of? Where's that? Who else was there? That's the Israelites. That's the wilderness they were in. See, all these stories recur. So David is in the same place that Israel was wandering around when they came out of Egypt. Exact same spot. Now, if you're a reader of narrative, those are supposed to be, you know, blinking lights to you. It's like, aha, he's down in the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Meidahl whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. That is, by the way, very rich in this day and age. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. You do that once a year. And now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. So any original reader of this story is going to go, okay, this is not going to go well. The guy's a fool. You know, he's a fool, and so this is not going to go well. So let's find about, the fool has a nice wife, though. And don't we all know that story? The woman was discerning and beautiful. As we would say in 2022, she was the package. Discerning and beautiful. Smart, good looking, the whole thing. But the man, again, see the contrast, was harsh and badly behaved. And he was a Calebite. Who was Caleb? Caleb was one of the spies for Joshua, right? Yeah. And they went into spy the promised land, and several came back and said, there are giants in the land, we can't do it. But Caleb came back and said, let's go get them. He's one of the good guys. So Nabal the fool comes from a line of good stock. Yeah. But as you know, good stock, there's always a glitch in the system, isn't there? There's always one kid, and it must have been Nabal. And David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, so David sent 10 young men And David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name, and thus you shall greet him." In other words, say this to him: "Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers, and now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm. They missed nothing at all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, because we did that for you, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." To your son David. All right, so what's going on here? Well, when you shear the sheep, that's festival time. My grandfather had hundreds of acres of wheat in Saskatchewan, Canada. And so, he would harvest the wheat. And he was a prosperous farmer because he had the farm and, of course, a house on the farm, but he had a house in town as well. Oh, that's right. Right next to the Lutheran church. I'll never forget it. He was Norwegian, so he was, when you're Norwegian, you're born a Lutheran, essentially. And so he would harvest the wheat. And you harvest the wheat, that's the money, right? You either have a good year or a bad year. And so the shearing the sheep, that's the money. And so when it's time to get the money and they shear the sheep, that's a big party. It's a big festival. And then based on Old Testament law, you probably remember this, that you would share. It was a time to share with those who were in need. So if you had, you would always share some of your crop, or in an act of discretion, you would just quietly leave some of the crop, so maybe those who didn't have could harvest it without being embarrassed. And the Old Testament, the scriptures put all of that in place so the culture could survive and do well. So David has now been in Paran, and what he has done, everybody knows who he is at this point, right? No one doesn't know who David is. He's killed Goliath. He's a great warrior. He's now married to the king's daughter. He's got 400 or 500 men with him. This is not some, riding around with a little posse of 4 or 5 guys. He's got an army with him. And he has protected Nabal's shepherds, which means he's protected Nabal's crop. Who's he protected them from in Paran? The Philistines. The Philistines. So he has done this service for Nabal without saying anything. And David is just exercising a custom. We've done this. It's feast day. My men would like whatever you have on hand. On hand doesn't mean give me what you have. It means whatever extra that you might be able to share with us. It would be great if we could participate in the feast and we could feed my men. He's got 500 mouths to feed every day. Think about that. 500 soldiers. You ever been on a military base? These guys can eat, right? So they're hungry. They're warriors. And Nabal knows that he's the beneficiary of the protection of David and his troops. And David comes to him with great humility, and he even says, "Your son David," which of course he's not. So verse 9, so there's the setup. This sounds like it should be a no-brainer. This should be real easy. But you're dealing with a fool, and when you're dealing with a fool, anything can happen. You never know what a fool's going to do, because fools do foolish things. So when David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who's David?" Now, that's not him being curious. He's like, who is this guy to me? He's nobody. Who's David? Who is this son of Jesse? Well, he clearly knows who he is, son of Jesse, right? So he's being diminutive. He's being condescending. He's saying, this guy is a nobody to me. I'm rich. I have, 3,000 of this and 3,000 of that, and I have a lot of shepherds, and this guy is he means nothing. And then he says, there are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. So you see what he's accusing him of? He knows that he and Saul are in trouble together. He's like, and he's not going to help him. He said, shall I take my bread? Now, look at this. Shall I take my bread? Shall I take my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from where I do not know where? You get the thrust? If you were reading this in Hebrew, it would just pop out at you. This is, the height of selfishness. So remember where we are here. We'll read to the end of this paragraph, and then I'll just point out a couple things. So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. He's a dead man. Strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword, and David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. We had 600 people. He leaves 200 to watch, for the provisions and the supplies. Takes 400 guys with him. This is not really great news for Nabal. So this is completely ticking off the wrong guy. All right, so let's just think about this for a minute. First of all, the principle in Genesis 4 was established when Cain kills Abel. And what does God say to Cain? Where is your brother? And what does Cain say to God? Am I my brother's keeper? And God says, yes, you are. And you're going to pay for this. The principle of the Christian life is that you are your brother's keeper. Period. You are your brother's keeper. We are responsible for one another. And so this story is designed to show, if you didn't figure it out from Nabal being a fool, you figure out just by the contrast of how David comes gently, wisely, according to the law of God and the custom, and humbly asks, and Nabal completely disses him. Completely condescending, completely rude. In this culture, this would have been like the slap in the face kind of thing, And David's reaction tells you how insulted he is. How insulted he is. Now, David has dealt with fools, and remember I said, David always wrote, and we can't put this psalm particularly that David wrote with this particular instance, but it's hard not to believe that David's experience of this didn't help him think through this psalm, Psalm 14, because he writes all these psalms, and this is like every good songwriter uses their personal experiences. That's what makes them good songwriters, And so in Psalm 14, David writes, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside, together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge? By the way, where's that quoted, those two verses? Romans 3. That's exactly what Paul uses to establish that without the grace of God and without the imputed righteousness of Christ, man has no hope, because there's none righteous. No, not one. In other words, we're all fools in that sense. Have they no knowledge of all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? See the reference to the bread that he doesn't get from Nabal? They are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice. Let Israel be glad. It's hard to believe that this incident with Nabal, because you're going to see how it turns out, and how the Lord uses Abigail to teach David a lesson. And a lot of us could benefit from wise women in our lives, and you're going to see Abigail play that role with David. So David now says, strap on his sword, and his whole position is, I am too good for this. I don't have to take this from anybody. Now think about this for a minute. Because it's going to become one of our little lessons, but if you read chapter 24, what has David done for Saul? This is the incident where David could have killed Saul, but just cut off a little bit of his garment and showed Saul that he protected him and that he would not retaliate against Saul. So he's coming off from a spiritual victory where he doesn't kill Saul. And Saul has been trying to kill him. And the time that you're, and we'll learn this is one of our lessons, but think about this. He's on the heels of a spiritual victory, and then he gets insulted, greatly insulted, to be honest, but nevertheless, and the first thing he wants to do is kill the guy. Is this godly? It is not. Thou shalt not kill is one of the 10 commandments, right? Thou shalt not murder is one of the 10 commandments. So when you read this, you're not supposed to say, oh, I need to make sure that I'm acting like David. No, you're supposed to read this and say, okay, that's not godly. we don't kill people who insult us. All right, it's not a good thing. So, you know, we'll see this here in a minute. But, one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us. Nabal's men are telling Abigail, David treated us like $1 million. He protected us. He did everything right. And they go tell Nabal's wife. They have enough sense to, you know, tell her. Yet the men were very good to us. We suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields. They didn't steal from us. They protected our stuff. As long as we went with them, they were a wall to us, both by night and by day. In other words, they were a wall of protection. They were like a fort around us. All the while we were with them and kept keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. So they come to Abigail. These are kind of nice guys, right? They can't stand the guy. They know he's worthless, and it's like, okay, we'll go talk to Abigail. Maybe she'll save him. You know, I mean, a lot of people have been like, let David kill him, right? But these kind of nice guys, we don't know anything about them other than they seem to be pretty honorable guys. All right, so David's insulted. So let's learn about 3 principles with David here. We'll get our first 3 principles on the night end. P-A-L or P-L-E? Principles. P-L-E. Good. This guy was never your pal at school, no matter what he said. What a bunch of good students. All right. All right, so we learned 3 quick things. First of all, the time that we sin the easiest is when your character is challenged. Nothing gets a person going so much as when they feel they've been wronged. I mean, you can almost do anything, but you insult someone deeply, and it's bad. Sin will bubble up so fast it'll make your head swim. And this is exactly what happens to David, a man after God's own heart, right? He is perfectly generous and godly with Saul. But when this guy, who he considers a nobody, and you remember what he said about Saul, I shall not touch God's anointed, nor lay a hand against my prophet. I won't do it. He wouldn't kill God's anointed because God had anointed him. But when it comes to Nabal, David's position is, you're not one of God's anointed, pal, I am. Think about that for a minute. That's a level of ego you don't want to have. And that's what went on with him. I'm anointed and you're not, and you insult me and you're going to die. And that is just raw ego, and sin will always creep in the door at that level of ego. 100% of the time. So you have to be really, 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 really careful. Because remember what the underlying motive of all of this stuff when we're sinning is? We're always saying the same thing in our head. Now, we don't say it, out loud. I don't mean that. But the rationale is always this. I'm too good for this. And the Bible says, no, you're not. No, you're not. I'm too good for this. And that's always the calculation we make. That's always the calculation we make. The second thing we learn is it's always easiest to fall after a spiritual high. And I'll say high or after a blessing. And why are we wired that way? Because what happens is, say the Lord really blesses you something. He gives you the guy of your dreams. He gives you the house you always wanted. He gives you, he blesses you, or just gives you a sense of his presence like you haven't had in a long time, or a sense of emotional peace. Something where you're feeling like, I'm on top of the world with Jesus. This is an unbelievable day. And that's the time you have to be most careful. Because it's in those moments that you'll forget that what got you to that spiritual blessing was grace. And you'll start thinking, I did it. And I'm special before the Lord. I worked really hard, and he rewarded me with this new house. I acted the way the Lord wanted me to act, and I'm kind of an attractive personality, and so she fell in love with me. I got that raise because, I deserve it, and the other people don't deserve it. And that's the calculation we start making, and we forget that everything we have, we are given. Remember what we learned on Sunday night in 1 Corinthians 6. What do you have that you were not given? If you forget that line for 1 second in your life, what happens is that sin creeps in because we start taking credit for the blessing of God, forgetting that all of God's blessings are a result of his grace and mercy towards us. And this is what happened. David forgot that he was where he was because of the blessing of God and the mercy and grace of God. He didn't deserve to be anointed king. He was a runt. He was out, no one wanted the kid, remember? And God picks him as the most unlikely choice. And at a certain point, he says, I'm too good for this. This guy does not know who he's dealing with. And he figures, you know what? I'll just kill him. And so that's what he went out to do. And then the third thing, now this is all about how to sin easily. So we avoid these three principles, right? Okay? These are bad. These are bad. But sin always creeps in when we are trying to protect our reputation. Reputation it's always a huge concern. Talk to your average 13-year-old girl, and she'll say this: I can't go to the mall looking like this. Everyone will see me. Now, at the average suburban mall in Philadelphia, I don't know, like 100,000 people in there at any given moment. You know how many people see a 13-year-old girl? Nobody. No one's looking, no one cares. Right? Oh, that's right. A 13-year-old boy. Yeah, exactly. Exactly, probably. There's at least one. But the frame of reference is everybody knows what's going on with me and sees it. And people always do this. They come into church and they think everybody knows their problem. And I say this to comfort them, but it's kind of an insult. And my answer is, actually, nobody cares about your problem. Not only don't they know, they don't actually care.
And they have their own.
They have their own. And that's what I'm trying to cure. I'm trying to get people to be interested in one another and care about each other. But the default is that no one is looking because they're too busy looking at themselves. And so what happens is we start to defend our reputation. We want to make sure that we're well thought of. And And David has been embarrassed in front of his men. He sent his men out there, he's king, and they come back, and you know how soldiers are. Is he going to put up with that? What kind of a leader would put up with that? I'm not the guy, I don't want to be running around with the guy. If Nabal's going to run over him, who else is going to run over him? Well, why would I want to be in his army? Right? So he's concerned for his reputation, and that's exactly what you can't be concerned for. So you know this, don't you? So remember what I said with 1 Peter chapter 2? You remember this? Peter's describing Jesus in 1 Peter chapter 2. I like verse 20. He says, verse 21, to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you in an example so that you might follow in his steps. Okay, what steps would that be? He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth, and when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he was insulted, he did not insult in return, and when he suffered, he did not threaten. But what did he do? He continued entrusting. In other words, that was a continuous process. And remember, we're talking about Jesus in his humanity. He continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly, and who's that? The Father. So one of the great ways that you can tell if sin is creeping into your life and you're struggling with maturity is the level of your defensiveness. How defensive are you? Does the hair get up on the back of your neck every time someone says something? And we always, we sing really loud, we stand up, and we look all holy to be like Jesus, to be like Jesus. And at the moment you're singing that in church, if someone whispered in your ear and said, you look horrible. I hate your dress. You'd have a hard time not backhanding the person right into the next pew, It's a hard thing for us. But what the scriptures are trying to teach you is when you are kept by the power of God, and when everything that you have, you realize is a result of the grace of Christ, then your reputation is in Christ. And so you don't need to protect him. You don't need to protect yourself. And it makes you, it doesn't make you a pushover, it makes you a tough cookie. You can laugh off anybody. You'll have skin that thick. It's not about being weak, it's about making you stronger. Remember we all used to tell the kids sticks and stones, but names never hurt you? Yeah. Now all the psychologists have made sure all the kids know that it will, devastate them forever. So we've raised a generation of sissies, so that went really well, didn't it? Yeah. So maybe we ought to get back to that. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt you. Toughen up. Jesus didn't revile in return. So it will create thick skin in you if you realize how dependent on Christ you are for his grace, and how your reputation is in him. And so if they make fun of you, so what? Laugh it off. Who cares? But don't grab your sword and go out and try to kill them. Probably not, a fabulous idea. And I always tell people, and it sounds, this is why no one comes to me for counseling. They'll come say, so-and-so said something and blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh, don't worry about it. You're much worse than they think. You're much worse than they think. If they knew the real you, they'd really hate you guys. Now, look, okay, that's not really funny, but what you're trying to teach people is when you recognize the depth of your own sin and embrace it, right? If you just know that without the grace of Christ, we're probably all half a step away from the penitentiary anyway, you know. I mean, just think about all these guys that we wanted to kill who cut us off in traffic and stuff like that. We've had murderous thoughts. We've all had murderous thoughts. It's just foolish not to admit that. So, you know, any insult that someone gives you, if you have in your head, it's like, if they knew the real me. So you can start laughing about it, right? That gives you tremendous durability, tremendously thick skin. And that's what you want in the Christian life. That will make you a good warrior for Christ. You won't be so easily offended. You won't be so defensive. You'll be a tough cookie. You'll be a tough cookie. But all that other advice about, you know, oh, get it out, is it? Not going to help you. All right, so David's in trouble, right? David's in trouble. Now, who's going to help David? Who is the Lord going to use to help David? Now, just say you get in a little bit. I have to watch myself and being recorded. I want to say things differently than I'm editing myself all the time. Because this kind of story, you have no idea how this story, because I'd want to kill him too. So say I get in, you know, a difficulty with my next door neighbor, and I think, you know, I'm just going to go punch him in the mouth and that's it. He just needs it, and I'm going to do it. And you know, and I'm in a tirade, and I'm angry, and I'm upset, and maybe it's justifiable. Maybe the guy is really an idiot, and he needs to slap in the mouth to straighten him out. Maybe that's what he needs. And so I'm going to deliver it, you know, because I'm not putting up with this anymore. Now, who's the last person I'm going to listen to? His wife. Because I'm thinking about slapping her too. Why are you living with this idiot? You know? So this is the last person you want to see coming, is the guy's wife, right? Okay, I had a funny line, but again, I'm on tape. I'm not going to do it. All right, so let's meet Abigail. All right, but one of the young men told, come back tomorrow, I'll give her all the funny lines when I'm not being recorded. But one of the young men told Abigail, and so we know where we're dealing with. Okay, now down to verse 18. Then Abigail made haste. So remember, now where we picked up, you know, the men have come, they've said, you know, your husband, no one can talk to the guy, and he's in trouble, and David is coming with 400 guys, and everybody's going to die. And so they come to Abigail. So Abigail, what does she do? Verse 18, she made haste and took 200 loaves. 200 loaves. All right, so she's going to feed a lot of people.
Something just happened.
Did we lose something?
Yeah.
Lost you.
All right, can you hear me anyway?
Yeah.
All right. If you're watching this by YouTube, we have lost our sound in the vestry here. So Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine. We're having a battery problem. That's what the issue is. 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. So she is bringing the provisions, right? She's going to feed these guys. Now that's smart. I mean, and that's not even one of my points, but let's think about this. So, you know, a bunch of guys, I'm going to feed these guys. You know? Way to a man's heart is what? There you go. Don't forget that. So the basics. And she said to her young men, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. And now David had said, surely in vain I have guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness. I've been guarding this guy, I've protected everything he has, and why have I wasted my time on this moron? So that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. Well, that's actually a fair description of what's happened. He's not wrong about that. The problem is, how do you respond to evil? Are you supposed to love your enemy or kill your enemy? All right, there we go. So God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. Now notice the self-righteousness. He invokes the name of God to engage in sin, which sounds like a lot of Christians. I mean, I wish I had a buck for every person who said, yeah, and the Lord told me to divorce my spouse. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. You know, they hear from God, the Lord told me to not have anything to do with that person again. No, they didn't. But he invokes the name of the Lord. So when Abigail saw David, she heard and got down from the donkey, and here it is. And just watch, we're going to learn some lessons from Abigail, but let's just read through it quickly. She fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal," this is her husband, "for as his name is, so is he." So as his name is, so is his name he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. He's a fool. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. I wish they'd have talked to me instead of my husband. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. That's a key line. The Lord has restrained you from saving with your own hand. That's the gospel in a sentence. You cannot save yourself. And the Lord restrains you from that and gives you his grace. That's the gospel in a whole sentence. Now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. So she calls him and reminds him of who the Lord is. So she, obviously, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living and in the care of your God. That's another great line. And the lies of your enemies shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you. Reminded David of the blessing that God had promised. She's reminding him of the promises of God, and has appointed you prince over Israel. She knows he's appointed as king. I don't know how she knows that, but she knows. My Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience. You're going to regret this if you do this. You're not going to be acting in a holy way for having shed blood without cause. He has no cause to shed blood before the Lord. None. For my Lord, here's the gospel again. Or for my Lord working salvation for himself. Do you understand that's our real problem? We're always trying to save ourselves. That's the gospel. We're always trying to save ourselves. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. Okay, let's get some lessons from Abigail. How does she deal with an angry fellow believer? All right, so get this in your head. You have a fellow believer, maybe it's your spouse even. They're angry, they're going to do something. Now David's is not angry with her, but he's angry with her husband in a big way. So what are the lessons? And there are 5 of them. And I'm just going to call this Abigail's wisdom. Abigail's wisdom. So first, she humbles herself. She came and bowed before David. That's verse 23, right? She came and bowed down. That's just being humble. Now, when you approach someone who's angry, is it wise to approach them like confrontively or just to come on a little bit humbly to start with? Humble. They're already ticked off. Look at her wisdom. I mean, this is a very wise woman. She knows that she's got an angry person on her hands, and so she comes humbly. She's not going to, add fuel to the fire. And then look what she does in verse 24. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt." So she confesses her role, and we have a word for this these days, and it's hard to get anybody to do it. It sounds easy when we're doing a Bible study, but to get people to take ownership of their own issue, they'll never do it. I mean, honestly, it's the hardest thing in the world for people just to take ownership of what their issue is in the situation. And we're saying, well, what issue does she have? She's married to the guy. The two shall be one. She knows that this is part of her family. She knows she has benefited from him. She knows that David has protected her income as well. And she knows her husband has acted foolishly. And yet, she said, she finds something to say, all right, this is partly on me. And what does that do? That reduces the defensiveness in David. She comes, she's humble. She takes ownership for whatever she can take ownership for. She doesn't lie. She doesn't exaggerate. She just, whatever she can take ownership for, she does. And then in verse 28, she does what? Please forgive the trespass of your servant. She asks for forgiveness. It's amazing how quickly things can be resolved with, you know what, I'm sorry. I didn't need to go there. My part in this. And usually what people want to do is say, all right, I'm sorry, but you did this, so of course, and that's a justification. You're not really sorry at that point. You're justifying behavior. And honestly, she is so humble because it's important to see how little she had to actually apologize for, if anything. Now, there must be something in there because I don't think it's phantom, otherwise it would be in Scripture. But it's next to nothing. It's so little, but yet she takes complete ownership of this, and she goes at it. And after she asks, and she asks forgiveness, and then what does she do in verse 27? And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young man. So she brings a peace offering. Now, guys who are smart know this. Now, this is the only illustration I come up with, so if this offends you, what can I do? I'm thinking off the top of my head here. I don't write these things down. So forget, you're out, and you're at the sports bar and you're watching the game, and, guy bumps into you and it's like, hey, there's a little bit of the thing, right? Humbly says, I'm sorry. No, you didn't bump into him. A smart guy will do this. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I wasn't seeing where I was going. I hope I didn't interrupt your evening. Hey, let me buy you a beer. Smart guy will do that. That's all she's doing. Simple, wise. It's a way to peacefully kind of handle things. So wise, so smart, and that's what she does. And then she does something that, of course, you can't do unless they're a fellow believer, right? All this stuff is good strategy. There's no bad strategy in this at all. This will get you out of a lot of jams, right? And that's verse 28, and then she said, please forgive the trespasses of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house. In other words, what God has promised you is going to happen, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. And evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. What does she appeal to in David? His godliness. She appeals to his godliness. So think about if you're with a fellow believer and you get in a scrape with them for who knows what it's over, but you get in a fight with them about something, and how that would be if you went to him or her and you said, I have always admired your love for the Lord, and I've always benefited from your love of the Lord. And you have been such an obvious blessing in our church, and I've seen that, and I've watched you so many times bless other people. Now, what if you started the conversation that way? It's hard for them not to say, yeah, I am kind of godly. But you see what she's doing, right? She appeals to his godliness, and do you have that? Because now I want to show you 3 ways that she did that. So these would be like A, B, and C under 5, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't have room. Can I erase that? Do you have it? All right. So I'm gonna kind of raise this up here. So she appeals to his godliness, and she does that in 3 ways. All right, verse 25 and 26, what does she do? Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for his name is, he is, Nabal's name. You read this, but I servant did not see the young man of the Lord whom he sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. Now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. Don't respond in kind. Don't become Nabal. Don't do this. This is one of the ways that she's pointing out he's going to lose his godliness if he responds by the way of the fool. Nabal's a fool. He's acted like a fool. He has set himself against the anointed of the Lord, and he knows it by his insult. Who is this David, and who is this son of Jesse? If Abigail knew that this was the anointed future king of Israel, of course Nabal knew that. Of course he knew that. So first of all, don't respond in kind. In verse 30 and 31, and when the Lord was done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation for himself. So she reminds him that future blessings are connected with present behavior. Did he ever learn that lesson, by the way? No, he didn't learn that lesson. Because eventually he's going to have Uriah killed and take Bathsheba. And do you remember the rest of the story? He spends the rest of his life in guilty conscience. The rest of his life. And this is exactly what she warned him would happen. Don't do it. And so the Lord used Abigail prophetically with David. And sadly, he didn't end up listening. And then finally in verse 30, and when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel. What is she appealing to? The sovereignty of God. We read over these little passages so quick, but that's the sovereignty of God. He didn't choose himself. God made a choice. And so the sovereignty of God, you can't possibly be godly and abandon the sovereignty of God. But that's the first thing we often abandon in our regular daily lives. God can't handle this. He's not big enough for this. God doesn't have a purpose. There's 101 ways to attack the sovereignty of God. It's not, it's one thing when people do it, they think they're making some rich theological point. They're actually being fools. To attack the sovereignty of God is, you lose God. He's just gone the minute you do it. But we do it in so many practical ways every moment of the day. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Keep praying that, because the king is ruling earth as it is in heaven. Period. It's happening. All right? So, now we want to see God's response in all this. And God's response is one that we are sometimes uncomfortable with, because God takes vengeance. Right? He blesses Abigail, but Nabal not so much. All right, so let's just read it real quick. We only have 10 minutes left. So we'll see if we can get this. And David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me." He finally understands that the Lord has sent Abigail. "Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand." I honestly, put that on your refrigerator, get it tattooed, I don't know. Don't work salvation with your own hand. That is the bottom line of almost all of our sin. "For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had heard and come to meet me." You see what happened? If he'd have killed Nabal, that would have hurt the whole family. In this culture, without Nabal, she's in trouble. There's no life insurance companies. New York Life doesn't exist. There's nothing like that. Everything's gone. All right. So, and David knows that. "Unless you had heard and come to meet me, truly my mourning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, "Go in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition." And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. Do you see the contrast? He's contrasting the fool with David. David's the real king. Nabal thinks he's the king. So he's feasting like a king, while the people that protected his harvest, he won't even feed them. And his wife has to sneak food to him. 200 loaves of bread, the lambs that are already prepared, the raisins, right? We read through it, the wine, the whole thing. They're going to have... But he's in his house, stuff in his face. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. Okay, look, if your husband's drunk, don't talk to him. It's not the time. All right, but I think you know that. All right. But she does too. Verse 6, "In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became a stone. He sobered up and realized he was that far from death, and she saved his life. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. We don't like these parts of the Bible. Ananias and Sapphira. We don't like it. Wait till we get to 1 Corinthians and people are misusing the Lord's table. And what does Paul say? When you eat and drink unworthily, you eat and drink judgment to yourself. And for this reason, many people sleep. They die. Now, you're going to die anyway, right? No one dies 1 second before the Lord decides to do that. Nobody. Nobody. But the wages of sin is death. And so Nabal dies for his sin. And we all die for our sin too, don't we? But where is our hope? Because we're united to the one who conquered death in his resurrection. When David heard that Nabal was dead, He said, bless the Lord. All right. I love these stories. I can't help myself. Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. And when the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to take you to him as his wife. And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail heard and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. Without David, she would have had no life. They'd have put her out. She'd have been a prostitute. There'd have been nothing left. That was that culture at the time. David knows that he's responsible for her, and so he takes her as his wife. There's a little problem, though. He's already married. To who? The king's daughter, Saul. But see how this ends. So David also took Ahinoam, of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing. What? Deuteronomy 17. If you are a king, you're not supposed to be doing this. But he's doing it anyway. Saul, and the reason he did this was what? Verse 44. And it just slips in, the narrator slips in that Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Galim. Saul gave away David's wife, which in that culture he could do because he was king. Saul would do anything to hurt David. But how does David respond to that sin? By taking 2 wives, which is sin. I'm sorry, it's sin. You can't do it, right? So, I don't know how you feel about this story. But it's a great story in the history of redemption, stuck right in the middle of David's wilderness journey. So remember what we learned, you got to stay big picture, right? You got to stay big picture. David is in captivity. This is in Saul's house. Saul has so much control over him, he can try to have him killed. David's on the run. He can take David's wife and give him to another man. He can do anything he wants. He's the king. But that drives David to the wilderness. And in the wilderness, what are you? You were tested. And what are you tested for? The coming promised land. Right? That's the giant 3-part paradigm of the whole of the Bible. Jesus is in captivity in his human flesh. His whole life is a wilderness. He's taken out into the wilderness. He's tempted by Satan. But every moment of his life is an attack of Satan. But he goes to death and rises from the dead to the promised land, the new heavens, the new earth. That's us. We're in captivity to sin and Satan. You're of your father the devil. We're in the wilderness. We call that sanctification, where the Lord tests us and changes us into the likeness of Christ. And in the new heavens and the new earth, he has promised us a future hope. And all that 3-part, you'll find that in all kinds of the individual stories of the Old Testament. So David's in captivity. He's tested in the wilderness. And you need to know it. Why? Because just like the Israelites, he fails. Which means what? You need a new Israelite. Who's that? Jesus. The Israel of God. He comes and does what Adam couldn't do, what David couldn't do, what Israel couldn't do, what no man can do. He's captured by flesh. He goes into the wilderness, but meets all the tests that no one else meets, and takes us to the promised land. All right? So David's in the wilderness, but right now he's failing the test badly. All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to learn your word. I pray tonight that you apply it to our heart through the Spirit. For the sake of Jesus, I pray. Amen.